joining me now to run through all the other top stories is writer and commentator Candice Holdsworth. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. I mean, we'll talk about reform in a minute, but China being accused of its malign attack on Britain's democratic institutions, fears it hacked 40 million voters' details. We weren't given the full story about this. Now we have it. We're hearing from the Deputy Prime Minister later today. But as we've seen over the weekend as well, even something as it's important, but of course not important to our democracy and the way people vote on the government of the day, is what the Princess of Wales has been saying. And we've seen so much misinformation, disinformation, attacks by foreign actors like China, like Russia and others, North Korea as well. This is a huge problem, Candice.
It is. It's what, like I mentioned earlier, when I was on the panel, that's what the digital warfare of the future is going to look like.
And it's of the present as well.
Yes, and we're going to have to start adjusting to that, especially as we start talking about increased defence spending. And you just wonder, where is that money best spent? And I mean, I think people sort of think very traditionally in terms of weaponry and armaments, but I think it's also going to have to be invested in intelligence.
I totally agree with you. And it's interesting because people say, when people think of conscription, which is a big argument as well, personally, any military people I speak to say they don't want people who don't want to be in the military. You shouldn't force people to do it. But when they talk about conscription, you often think of sort of 18-year-olds running around fields and shouting at one another and firing rifles and so on. But actually, I wonder if there are people later on in life, perhaps, who are good at computers, for example, who can deal with this, who could maybe even work from home. I mean, maybe you wouldn't want to do that from a security point of view, but actually people who can contribute to the fight against China and Russia, because so much of the war is now online. It's not necessarily about tanks and planes, although that's important as well.
That's a very interesting point. Yes, it's going to require a whole new skill set. But I do think younger generations who've grown up online and are very literate about public discourse and the way it's conducted online could actually have a lot to offer. I mean, they are true, you know, you always use the phrase, they are true digital natives, and they are, and they may be attracted to this. I mean, that's one way to sell it to young recruits. I mean, they obviously don't want to go and die in some field somewhere, but if they can
that's kind of part of it as well.
Yes.
That's what many people have done and sacrificed their lives for our society, and of course that will continue, but kind of in a different way.
Yes, well, it is. It's maybe a bit more problem solving. It's more cerebral, and that might attract people. And attracts a new generation, because that is one of the problems the army has said that they've had. They've struggled with recruitment.
What sort of relationship do you think we should have with, for example, China? I mean, we want their investment, we want their products, although some people say we should manufacture far more in this country, and I agree with them. And actually, even the people from an environmental perspective say, well, we're importing so much, and that is carbon emissions and all the rest of it. So there are all sorts of arguments around this, some of which I agree with, some of which I don't. But really, you cannot ignore China. You can't just say, right, we're going to be isolationists, we're going to completely ignore one of our most important trading partners. But if they are spreading slurs against the Princess of Wales, if they're hijacking our voting records and so on, how do you square that circle?
It's very difficult because we just don't have a straightforward relationship with them, like you say. We're so economically intertwined with them, and so much manufacturing has gone to China over a number of years that it's actually very difficult for us to disentangle ourselves from them. But of course, you know, things are becoming a bit more adversarial with China. I think people thought that the more that we sort of cooperated economically, the better relations would be, but that's not necessarily the case.
And many politicians, including a certain Prime Minister called David Cameron, thought that would be the case. Another Prime Minister who changed her views dramatically on this was Liz Truss. There's a great book about this called Out of the Blue by James Heal, who sometimes contributes to this station. And of course, Harry Cole, the political editor of The Sun, who's got a brand new show actually on this station and online as well, called Never Mind the Ballots, which is on Thursdays at 8 o'clock. They've written a great book about Liz Truss, and they chart her views on China being really, really pro-China at one point, saying we've got to engage, we've got to get all their business, we've got to have all those economic relationships. And now, where she, like other people, like Ian Duncan Smith, Tom Tugendhat, for example, the security minister, who have been told they are not welcome in China. They've actually been banned from China. So there's a very difficult tightrope for Rishi Sunak and others to walk, and Keir Starmer as well, when he almost certainly becomes Prime Minister.
Yes, I mean, you've sort of seen a big rise in nationalist sentiment in China, which has changed the relationship compared to maybe 20, 30 years ago, when they really did want to integrate into the global economy again. On the other side of it, do we need to be pragmatic? Is it better to keep China on side? Do we want to make an enemy out of China?
Know thine enemy, keep your enemies close.
I know, because we're in a very unstable world and there's all kinds of shifting alliances, and we're sort of wondering, you know, we have to figure out, who we can treat as not necessarily friends, but people who are kind of useful.
Yeah.
To not be in
But also
conflict
there's that moral
with...
outrage, of course, over their treatment of the Uyghur Muslims, for example, with
that.
Russia, of course, where we have this basically proxy war in Ukraine as well. It's a massive, massive issue. Let's turn to domestic thoughts on this, because Labour have been under a lot of criticism for many years, really, and certainly a long time. And there have been lots of people, including the Conservative Party, talking about a hole in their finances over their Green New Deal, over their thoughts on net zero, £28 billion. But actually, we're going to talk to Ian Mansfield from Policy Exchange, a think tank in London, in a minute, about how their plan to make the electricity grid carbon zero by 2030 could actually cost £116 billion. That's money this country just doesn't have, Candice.
I know, and this is what the IMF economist Olivier Blanchard was talking about a few years ago. He made a few months ago, he made a lot of headlines about it. He was saying that if we're going to fund net zero, it's going to have to be through increased borrowing, because you just won't be able to justify the extra taxation, because the costs are going to be huge. They're going to be enormous. We have to be pragmatic about that, and we have to think how we're going to justify that to voters. I mean, what you want to hope for is that you get such good technological innovation that's adopted, widespread adoption, and it brings prices down.
Yes.
But at the moment, we're not seeing that. Unless, of course, people are willing to be pragmatic and, think of things like gas as a bridging fuel until we get to net zero, for example, and not just immediate decarbonisation.
And that is, I mean, there is this real leap towards that, isn't there? And this thought that fossil fuels, of which we're sitting on loads of them, actually should never be used in some people's opinion. But that's just not realistic, is it, Candice?
I don't think so. And, from what I know, the debates that went on amongst various people on all different sides of this debate, that was what people thought. They thought that gas, being the cleanest of those, is the fuel that we would use. But I think that there is a sort of extremist element that's just trying to sort of shut that down and move immediately to renewables. But I don't think that that's achievable. I think that, things like electric cars, for instance, there was a lot of enthusiasm for them at the beginning, and it was great, and it seemed like this is the way forward. But over time, you've seen people have become a bit disillusioned with them, especially in the second-hand market. They're not selling well. They don't have a good
I did an
range.
interview about this over the weekend, actually, with someone who'd spent a lot of money on an electric Porsche.
Yes.
And now it's worth less than a quarter of what it was previously. There are all these problems about the heaviness of the electric vehicles as well. We have potholes as a massive problem as well. I mean, there are just so many issues around that. I know you will have been as upset as me, Candice, to see that story that Just Stop Oil was infiltrated by a very enterprising Mail on Sunday reporter, and someone from Just Stop Oil, these eco-loons on the left, said that they were too white and middle class. Who'd have thought that an organisation that puts up spokespeople called Indigo Rumbelow, that is her real name, and Alex de Koenig, which means Alex of the King, or Alex of the King, I think, who told my producer to go F himself at one point, and then, in fairness, apologise, but I'll never interview him again, we're too white and middle class and perhaps slightly detached, actually, from the real lives of people who chose not to actually go out and support their ludicrous vigilante protests.
I think that's true, and I think that's why there's a sort of failure to understand why people don't want to adopt certain expensive technologies, and also why people still are very reliant on their cars. They're still very reliant on fossil fuels, because people have ordinary incomes and ordinary budgets, and they have to put that first. I mean, I think for the most part, the consensus is people think this is something that we need to address.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Candice. Like, I don't think anybody wants to pollute the planet. No. I don't think there's anybody who says, I won't do my bit. I'll recycle. Yes, I'll maybe fly a bit less, although some people are very much against that. But actually, maybe there's something we can do. But there are so few people who actually feel they personally can make a difference, or even we as a country can make a difference when our emissions are about 1%.
Oh, that's huge as well. I mean, that's also a massive, massive thing. I mean, how much, Britain has done very well in reducing its global carbon emission contribution, but the big polluters are elsewhere. Yeah. That doesn't mean we have to give up.
You don't see a huge amount of thanks and sort of congratulation, essentially, from the Green lobby, saying just how much the UK has reduced its carbon emissions. It's always more and more and more, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, they're fanatical. There's a fanatical element. I think this is the problem, and I think this is the problem that so many people have. You know, it's not that we disagree, it's not that we don't think that climate change is happening or it's not happening. It's the solutions. That's what a lot of people have a problem with. The solutions that are proposed, they're just not practical, and in many ways will make people poorer and colder, and it will mean a huge drop in our living standards. And I don't think anyone's ever I don't think ordinary people have ever had a say in that.
Well, they haven't, although I come back to the point that net zero, for example, as a policy was in all the major parties' manifestos in 2019, but of course the 2019 election wasn't about net zero, it was about Brexit.